Oh, dang blasted, isn't anybody in this dadgum cemetery dead?
I didn't want to cause a fuss, but now that you mention it...
I know what you're thinking, that title is way too clickbaity to be true, but hear me out. The roguelike genre, at least as we once knew it, is quickly fading. What I mean by that is that the games that built up and defined the genre at first no longer really describe the new games that come out that are so-called roguelikes. So while there are plenty of games that call themselves roguelikes, their resemblance to the foundations of the genre are pretty minimal, honestly. This isn't really a problem for most, but for developers and players new to the genre that are trying to find more games to get into, it could actually get rather confusing. But in order to properly understand this, let's quickly dive into the history of roguelikes first. Now, the term roguelike comes from the game Rogue that came out over 40 years ago at this point in the 1980s. It was sort of a D&D dungeon crawler game that had randomized playthrough each time you booted it up. It was sort of turn-based, where every time you moved your character, the enemies would immediately move afterward too, and it had that infamously harsh death mechanic where if you did die, it would completely reset all progress that you had made in the game, and you would have to start over from the very beginning. What I mean is that absolutely nothing carries over. It's as if you're booting up the game for the first time again whenever you die. The only thing you actually retain is the knowledge that you gained from previous runs when you play. But don't discount the randomization in the game. It's actually an important feature to it and the genre that it spawned, because without the randomization, it would be more like an arcade game where you could memorize the levels and the enemy placements and get better at it by just knowing what happens next, but you can't do that in Rogue. And with that, we're able to establish three rather simple rules that I think define the roguelike genre best here. 1, turn-based, 2, random, and 3, perma-death. Now, I know that you're thinking that first rule has already been broken hundreds, if not thousands of times in order to describe a roguelike, but for many years, this was actually part of the rule set in order to describe the genre. Other developers were quick to take the formula that Rogue created and make their own games with it. Namely, big titles like NetHack and Moria were very popular and really helped cement that formula that Rogue created, and thus the roguelike genre was truly born after so many other developers hopped on the same train. But we're still talking about games that were made in the 1980s, and the genre didn't really garner a large audience, at least not in the long term. It wasn't until many years later in the late 2000s that important titles like Spelunky and The Binding of Isaac brought attention to the roguelike genre and brought a much larger audience to it too. But this is also when we started to see a shift with indie developers that wanted to make their own roguelikes, but they didn't want to follow the rules too strictly. So to describe these new roguelike likes, the term roguelite was born. So what is a roguelite exactly? Well, it was first used to describe a game that tries to follow the roguelike rules, but kind of bends a few of them. But as time goes on, the description became a bit more narrow, interestingly, and now it only really describes the third rule, permadeath. Developers saw a great opportunity in roguelikes, but wanted to create a more forgiving experience, so permadeath became a little less permanent. So now roguelites will feature some kind of carryover between playthroughs, or runs as we call them, such as meta currency for upgrades or unlocks or cosmetics, you name it. This proved to be a great formula to get people into the genre, with games like Rogue Legacy kind of spearheading the movement, which allowed the player to grow a lot more powerful no matter how many deaths that they took. In fact, most roguelites nowadays build the game around the idea that the player is going to die a lot, and therefore give more power to the players as they do. But a problem began to grow in the shadows, because fewer and fewer roguelikes were actually being made. And even though we had a new term specifically for their games, the developers of the roguelites kept calling their games roguelikes, because they don't want to miss out on that potential revenue, because a new player might not understand this niche genre. You see, those developers really don't want to miss out on any potential sales, so I think what ended up happening was they would call their games roguelikes first and foremost, and then also include at the end of their little summary of tags, Roguelite, just in case people actually cared. So now we have a bunch of Roguelite games being released as Roguelike games, so much so that Steam actually had to add another tag to help players identify the differences between the games, and that is going to be the traditional Roguelike. This tag is meant for games that follow that original rule set that we discuss much more closely, thus letting potential players know that that old school level of difficulty is going to be there if they want it. So what does this mean for us and why is it important? Well, this comes down to the meat of the conversation, I think, and I'm here to make the case that roguelites are roguelikes. You see, I believe that the term roguelike has now evolved into more of an umbrella term meant to cover a wide spectrum of games that are mostly identified by this randomization that we discussed and some semi-permanent death mechanics. Developers and platforms have already adopted this way of thinking. Like I discussed earlier, developers will always use the tag roguelike when they're trying to describe their roguelites. So it's really just up to us as players to finally agree that, hey, you know what? These are all pretty much under the same umbrella and it's okay. Trying to keep separating these two styles and little subgenres of games is like trying to fight the tide. It's just a losing battle. And it's okay to lose this battle. It's not a big deal. The history of the genre will not be erased by simply accepting this change as players. And I think it'll actually only help us unite a player base for a love of these style of games, really, and that way we don't have to squabble over the minor differences between them. This will also help developers label their games more easily and help players find the right games for them, since chances are if you got into roguelikes in 2023 or even in the past few years, it was most likely a roguelite. And the bottom line is that this term roguelite has just not really caught on, even after over 10 years of use. We just don't see people using the term very broadly, whereas the term roguelike is kind of synonymous with what we see in these games. I even have an analogy for you here. You see, when cell phones were first introduced, they really only had one function: to make and receive phone calls. Eventually, manufacturers started tacking on more features to the cell phone, and one of the first things that we got was adding a camera to take pictures with on the cell phone. And with that, we got a new term for this device, the camera phone. So now you're no longer just buying a cell phone, you're buying a camera phone. And I know all the marketing material that you saw made sure that you knew you were getting a camera phone. Well, as we all know, as time went on, cameras just became an obvious feature with a cell phone, and you didn't really have to market it. You could tell us what kind of camera and how good the camera is, but the term camera phone just kind of became completely redundant because we knew the cell phone we were getting was going to have a camera, so the term just died out. And that's when we come back to our debate, and I think it's about time, unfortunately, that we let the term roguelite go the same way as the term camera phone. It's just not necessary anymore. And this is when I think a lot of the purists will take kind of an insult to the original roguelikes, but don't worry, we can have that term traditional roguelike that we can find, and I think that is actually an important tag that well describes the games that it is applied to. Honestly, maybe it's just me that cares so much about this stuff, but I'm so tired of seeing people on the internet correcting these strangers, telling them this game that they love, it's not a roguelike, it's a roguelite, and then just causing this confusing argument and debate over what is and what isn't, what counts and what doesn't. We're overcomplicating the situation. Just say, hey, welcome to the club. Here are some other great games that you might like that I really enjoyed too. I know I'm not going to convince the type of people that just enjoy touting their knowledge about a specific subject like this, but maybe I can give them something to think about, and maybe they do have some compelling arguments as to why I'm wrong here, so I'm willing to hear you out at least. Now, maybe part of it is that these people just want more true roguelike games, or at least games that have a more permanent death mechanic, right? After all, I do hear quite a few veterans of the genre say that they really wish they didn't have to grind out for all these different meta upgrades in a new roguelike just to get on par with the players that have a few more hours than them, and I can definitely understand that. And I'm not even here to say that roguelites are better than roguelikes, certainly not. I don't even have a particular preference over which one I think I like more. But I do think trying to squabble over the tags isn't really gonna help developers decide which type of game they're going to make. What is going to help them decide is where you spend your money. See, the problem is that traditional roguelikes simply don't have a large audience. So if you want more games like that, you need to support the developers that are making them and spend your money with them. If you keep spending your money on roguelite games, as we are currently calling them, developers are going to keep making roguelite games. So while traditional roguelikes are a dying breed, there are a few games that have come out that have kept that traditional aspect alive and well. Games like Caves of Cud and Tales of Maj'Al have done a really great job of sticking to the formula very closely, while also being complex, interesting, and most importantly fun. While these games are miles away from the kind of success that the genre's biggest sellers get, it is still nice to see that there are options out there for players that are looking for this style. The developers are clearly passionate about their games, and I think we should celebrate them for it, but I also think at the same time, we shouldn't punish other developers for not following the same rule set. It's also sad to say that we haven't really had a new traditional roguelike in several years that made any waves. These games just aren't easy to make, and the risk versus reward, well, just might not be worth it now. In the meantime, more subgenres to the roguelike category are being born left and right. Bullet heavens are all the rage right now, with games like Vampire Survivors and Halls of Torment bringing a lot of new players into the roguelike genre. So while the term roguelike is alive and well, the games that built up the genre are slowly fading away. Meanwhile, we've had this birth and rise of what we've been calling roguelites take over the entire genre, and clearly players love them. And now it has gotten to the point where there are far more roguelite games than roguelike games actually coming out. And you can go ahead and use the term roguelite still if you want, as long as you let other people use the term roguelike if they wish. Look, I just want to be able to have a conversation about my favorite games without someone coming in and pointing out the differences between these tiny little subgenres. I mean, the developers of these roguelikes have already moved on and accepted it as an umbrella term, so it's just us players left. Just remember that accepting these games as the developers choose to define them will not diminish the accomplishments of their predecessors. Thanks for watching.